So again, I said,
I just remembered to start that.
oh, this, okay. And also hello to everybody over Zoom. I am someone who does not mind being interrupted at all. I come from a family where on both sides, if you just didn't shout your way into the conversation, you just were not going to participate. So I truly don't mind. And also there are no silly questions. My role is as an educator. So if you're worried about saying the wrong thing, even if you do say the wrong thing, I will gently point that out because I'm assuming you're asking because you're here in the spirit of learning. And I hope that all of us in this room can also hold that space, that we're all at different learning moments. So the first part in the series is happening today, and that's where to even begin. And so I did send a couple of things. Well, of course it doesn't work now.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're.
Okay, so this has to be clicked
Oh,
in
it's
order for it
activated.
to work. Is it working?
Perfect.
Okay.
So I did send some things out that were totally optional to review. If you didn't see them, that's also okay. It was just to help maybe prompt some ideas and some thinking around this topic. So the two things I sent out were a cartoon, just a single frame cartoon called Street Calculus. And for those of you who didn't see it, it's essentially depicts two people walking along a street. One is a white man, one is a black man, and there are thought bubbles coming from each of their respective heads. And it has a checklist, two different checklists. One checklist on one side is checklists of safety, and one is related to checklists indicating danger. And then for each man, they are assessing the person in front of them as they're walking by. And for both on their respective lists, the safety list had more things checked than the danger list. And so both of them say hello to one another. And so why would I include that in a conversation about DEI and organizations? Or for folks who were able to view it before, what were some initial thoughts that you had in viewing it?
I don't think it made it out.
Oh, it did? Oh, that's okay.
For not enough.
Okay, that's okay.
I just dropped a link.
Yeah, and that's okay. So maybe I'll do this instead. So the reason I sent that out is because what it displays to me is that we all have these sort of mental frameworks. You might call them biases, you might call them stereotypes, that we use in our everyday life for literally every single moment. Biases and stereotypes are actually innate to the human condition. You cannot exist as a human being and not operate using biases and stereotypes. And the idea, and there's much research to demonstrate that, and the idea is that we use stereotypes to assess threats in our environment. And so because we have so much information that we are exposed to every single day, and it seems like it's increasing every single day, I think one research showed that it was like hundreds and hundreds of commercials alone that we see on a daily basis. There's no way that as humans we'd be able to properly digest everything we see. So we use biases and stereotypes to quickly assess what's important and what's not. For example, everybody can see, most people can see their nose. But your mind sees it so often and it knows it's not important, so you just don't see it anymore. But you actually do physically see your nose.
Is it helpful to have this up?
No.
Not anymore? Okay.
Yeah. Thank
Apologies.
you. And so the other thing I sent out was a conversation between a white therapist and his Latina client. And in the conversation, it's very clear, again, that will be sent out to you, but it's very clear that he's just missing what she's telling him. And what she's telling him is that she's struggling with two things: cultural pressures from her parents and objectification by her white boyfriend, and stereotypes about Latinas in general. And the therapist is just not acknowledging it, and in fact says like, well, we're all the same. Now, is that true? Yes, but he just wasn't reading the room right. That maybe wasn't the right moment to say that. And so by not acknowledging and hearing what she's saying, she literally states, I just feel like I don't get anywhere here. Why do I come here and whenever I do, I just end up feeling worse? And I include these to talk about a couple of things. One I just mentioned, which is that bias and stereotypes are an element of the human condition. It doesn't matter how privileged you are or how marginalized or oppressed you are. Everybody has bias. And the problems with biases, as Shimamanda Adichie would tell us, and stereotypes, it's not that they are untrue, it's that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And if you haven't seen that video from her, it's a few years old now, the danger of a single story. I highly encourage you to watch that video. And so, of course, because biases are so, I see them as stories we tell ourselves over and over, or that we see over and over, to the point that we don't realize that that's the story we're telling. When someone new walks into the room, we're already telling ourselves stories about them without us realizing it. And so the goal is not necessarily to stop doing that, because we'll never stop doing that, but to catch in the moment what we're saying. So how does this link to organizations? Well, organizations are made up and comprised of people. And so oftentimes in organizations, there are elements of biases and stereotypes that are present within the culture, in the policies that we set up, in the procedures, whether those are formal or informal procedures. And it's not just with the way that we maybe treat our clients, it's how we treat one another in the organization as well. And so that's why this conversation to me is really important when we're talking about biases and stereotypes. And so how would you get started? Like, where would be some good starting points? So there might be some strategic plans that the organization has already completed or is in the middle of, right? Typically, strategic planning cycles are 3 to 5 years. And so assessing where are we with those strategic plans? Was DEI, or were elements of DEI embedded in that strategic plan? If no, well, that's definitely a good place to start. And if so, what's the progress like? Or if you're at the end of the cycle, what were the outcomes? And where do we need to go from here? Climate surveys are also a really great idea. So not only assessing the climate or the, like, let's say customer satisfaction, right? So how do the clients that you serve, what are their thoughts and feelings about their experience? But then also the employees themselves. So an employee satisfaction survey, and really asking dedicated questions about, do people feel like they can bring their whole selves to work? Questions that get at belonging. Questions that also are open-ended and leave an opportunity for folks to give feedback, whether that be positive or maybe some opportunities for growth. One that I think I see a lot of organizations focusing on is employee turnover. And also just employee demographics. So not only looking at maybe the diversity and all the ways that we can be diverse of your employees, but also when you look at folks who leave their positions, maybe sooner than you would like, what are the demographics of those folks? In other words, who is leaving the organization fairly soon after entering? And there are some organizations, particularly in higher education as an industry, we see that people of color, whether those be employees or faculty members, do tend to leave institutions, especially if they're predominantly white institutions, at a quicker rate than white employees. Now, I'm not saying that that is necessarily true for you, but if you don't know that information, that might even be a good place to start. And so let's say based on some initial things that you're gathering, right, those data points, you decide that there does need to be something to be addressed around improving the welcoming environment of people of color in your organization. And so here would be some, I have my notes in my computer. There we go. So here's some common things that would be a good idea to look at. And I think sometimes something that's ignored is not only when an employee starts at your place of, at your organization, but how are you even going about recruiting to increase the diversity of the applicant pool in order to then hire someone who might be a person of color or would otherwise help increase the diversity of the employees, right? Basically, we're trying to get higher up in the funnel. it's much more difficult to hire someone who might increase diversity in your organization if they're already feeling that there's a barrier, or if they're just not even applying at all to the positions you're posting. Makes it a little bit challenging. And so you might look at the job description themselves. And specifically, one thing that I like to ask, and that I've been asking in my organization, is that graduate degree really required? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a preferred qualification maybe around that, but are we actually sure that we need that to be required? What is the actual number of years of experience we really need in order for this person to be successful? Now, part of that is, well, we want them to be experienced, so we don't have to invest too much time in training them. I would actually say, I would rather, and there are 4 positions I'm currently searching for, I would actually rather invest time in them to train them up, because by demonstrating that I'm invested in them, they're more likely to stay, because they see that you're investing your time, and it's more likely that they would then invest their time and stay. Sometimes job requirements or skills are very vague. Like, what do we actually mean when we mean excellent verbal skills or excellent communication skills? I really don't know what that means. So might it be better to say strong communication skills or strong presentation and facilitation skills? Is that what is really the focus of the job? Or is the focus of the job really about responding to people over the phone or over email? So then say in written communication or in communication over the phone. Are you open to transferable skills? For example, at Eastern, there were positions for a donor officer, right? So these are people who go out and solicit donations for the university. And one of the things that my colleague Vanessa and I noticed is that they required a number of years of prior donor relations experience. And so they were shocked that they could only get about 2 or 3 people to apply to the position. And I'm like, okay, so if I'm thinking about donor relations, what would it be helpful to just say that sales experience would also count? Because I would assume that there are a lot of transferable skills there. And when I also think about the field of donor relations, if you're looking for prior experience in donor relations, I think you might maybe not be too shocked to know that the majority of people who are in the field of donor relations are white. So if you're requiring that experience prior to it's just, again, the barrier for getting people or opening up the position to increase the possibility that people of color can apply. And the last thing that I'm requiring, and that I'll show examples of in future series, is around the division's equity action plan that I drafted. And one thing that I'm requiring in all new job postings, a required skill is demonstrating an understanding or in some way some competence or exposure to cultural competence. Every single job needs to have that. So let's say, right, so no matter who is hired, right, we are expecting that you're going to contribute to a culture where everyone feels like they belong, regardless of how you identify. Who is on search committees is really important. And I would even say setting up expectations to be able to challenge one another. Right, so I was the chair of our psychological counselor position search, and there was one candidate, very green, and had an MSW or was working toward licensure as a LCSW. Well, we didn't have anybody on our psychological staff who was an LCSW, and so in terms of supervision, we can't provide that for her. She has to get that outside the organization, and so that was well, that's going to be difficult for us to do. Who knows if she'll actually do it? And I'm like, but so she has a background that a lot of our students have been asking for in terms of psychological counselors. And the barrier you're creating is that we think it will be difficult for her to get supervision from us. but she can get supervision elsewhere. She's young, yes, but again, if we invest in her and show her that we are dedicated to her, if she's willing to dedicate time to us, I think we will see the benefit in the long run. Not to mention, then we get an LCSW on staff, and now we can potentially increase, we can open up our positions to MSW graduates seeking hours, which could increase the number of hours of direct client services that we can provide. But I had to be the advocate because no one else on the committee was willing to do that. And I'm pretty convincing, as you might tell. I'm pretty convincing, which is why I was asked to be the chair of that search committee. But these are the sorts of questions to ask yourself. So as a search committee, that's another potential barrier, right? So I'm not saying that we should forego qualifications. That's not what I'm saying at all. But really interrogating each other about the biases that are coming up inevitably, right? As we just talked about, that will inevitably come up when we're reviewing applications. And then the last thing that I'll share is the interview process. Gone are the days where we can take 2 or 3 months to actually, by the time the position closes and the time that we hire, gone are those days. You're going to significantly lose people, because what I will tell you is, if you're a strong candidate and you have several identities that might be marginalized, you pick your job. They have the choice right now. And so in order to be competitive, we need to be more nimble in our process. Also, do you really need to bring someone in to do a 5-hour interview? Which is actually pretty standard to higher ed. I have been on interviews where it's been a day and a half. Is that really necessary? Do we really care what our campus community stakeholders think, or do we just need to select 1 or 2 people and have a 30-minute conversation? Now that's up to you. And higher ed is very archaic sometimes in the way that we do things. So that might not be an issue for you, but something else to consider, right? Is how nimble and how quickly can you move? And I'll read this quote from Neil Strauss. We get stuck in old thought and behavior patterns that may have been effective when we were 12 months or 12 years old, but now only serve to hold us back. And while those around us may have no problem correcting our minor flaws, they let the big ones slide because it would mean attacking who we are. And I would actually connect this to organizations. I think sometimes we're so scared of pointing out the big flaws because it might be an attack on the values of our organization, or how progressive maybe our organizations are, or might it make our executive leadership feel attacked? And I think I bring this up because it might feel that way, and that's natural and normal and necessary. Right? And it's always, right, it's not about the people. It's about the behavior or the outcomes. Yes, I understand that you have progressive values, or you value anti-racism, and I'm telling you that the outcomes in the organization are reflecting that there are some issues around race. Those can both be true. That requires a lot of trust, though. So I think part of this, right, and when you're reflecting on this later, is how can you begin to slowly have those conversations so that way you're not coming in hot and immediately putting people up on a defensive. That's my go-to. I just love coming in, being very direct. You're a problem, or this is a problem and you need to fix it now. I have learned over 10 years, not good. Or, I mean, you can do whatever you want, right? But not as effective, I have found, as finding other ways to say the same thing, but just with a softer landing. So still saying what needs to be said, but saying it in a way that doesn't put people on the defensive. And so at this point, I think that's the clock. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. So what I'll say before that is, so the next session, we'll be going over some real life examples from Eastern with some information redacted for proprietary reasons. But from the equity action plan, what units in student affairs have done to address maybe some issues that are impacting our students, because that's our focus is students, right? Student affairs. And then part 3 will be lessons learned. So times when I definitely went in too hot and could have done it differently, and I would love to share that with all of you so you don't do the same thing. But any questions for now?
Just want to say that behavioral health supervision was a very astute example for a lot of people in this room who have been dealing with that. Because I was thinking as you were talking about, okay, a lot of the folks in this room are hiring for things that actually do need that specific, qualification.
Yes.
For whatever reason, going into a clinical setting. So having the examples of here are the other ways you might be creating blocks was, I think, something that was really great. And I'd love to, for next month, if it's okay to invite folks to bring in their examples of maybe things that they've tried too. Because higher ed and clinical settings probably have some different challenges and some similar challenges.
Other questions, or not even questions, just thoughts, reflections before we end our time together?
Anybody on Zoom? You can go ahead and come off of mute or use the chat. I just want to remind everybody that Better Health Together did an HR learning cohort where we sponsored only 2 organizations to go through it. And it was like really long, intensive cohort. And there was a ton of interest. So I hope that this is landing well with you and you're able to take some of this back to your org and to your HR and be the wonderful person like Nick who presses buttons until things change. So, yeah.
Well, thank you all for your time. Today, you will see me, I forget when I come in next, but it's on the calendar. So I'll see you in a couple of weeks. And I'll bring in some real life examples, but I'll also try to weave in some time where if there's someone who wants to share with their example, we